Hello everyone. The topic of discussion is an important topic from neuroanatomy, which is the cerebellum. So we will start with an introduction to cerebellum. So the cerebellum is also known as the small brain. For an average adult, the weight of the cerebellum is nearly 150 gram. So this 150 gram is nearly equal to 10% of the weight of cerebral hemispheres. And the cerebellum is located in the posterior cranial fossa. So the floor of the cranial cavity is divided into anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa and the posterior cranial fossa. The cerebellum is located in the posterior cranial fossa. The relations of cerebellum, anteriorly we have the fourth ventricle, the pons and the medulla. In the diagram we can clearly see that in front of the cerebellum you have the cavity which is known as the fourth ventricle, and in front of the fourth ventricle we have the pons as well as the medulla. The midbrain is also a part of the brainstem, but it is not found anterior to the cerebellum. Just above the cerebellum we have the cerebrum, but the cerebrum is separated from the cerebellum by a fold of dura mater which is known as the tentorium cerebelli. So we have discussed the introductory part, and now we are going to study cerebellum under the following headings. First we will look at the external features, then we will look at the internal structure, the microscopic structure and the histology. Then we will learn about the connections of cerebellum, and finally we will end with arterial supply. So the external features of cerebellum. The external features can be studied under the following headings. First we have the parts of cerebellum, then the surfaces of cerebellum, the fissures and the lobes of cerebellum. The parts. The cerebellum has two parts. It has a midline worm-like structure which is known as the vermis, and on either side of the vermis you have the two lateral cerebellar hemispheres. Surfaces. The cerebellum has two surfaces, superior surface as well as the inferior surface. On the superior surface the vermis is indistinct because it merges with the two lateral hemispheres, while on the inferior surface the vermis is very distinct and it lies on a depression known as the vallecula. On either side of the vermis we have the paramedian sulcus. The paramedian sulcus actually separates the vermis from the two lateral hemispheres. The first diagram shows the superior surface of cerebellum. The vermis in the superior surface is indistinct. It merges with the two lateral hemispheres. The second picture shows the inferior surface of cerebellum. Here we can clearly define the vermis. It lies on a depression known as the vallecula, and on either side of the vermis you have a sulcus known as the paramedian sulcus which separates the cerebellum, the cerebellar hemispheres from the vermis. Coming to the fissures of cerebellum. The cerebellum has many fissures, but only three of them are prominent. They are the primary fissure, the horizontal fissure and the posterolateral fissure. The primary fissure is actually seen in the superior surface. The posterolateral fissure is seen on the inferior surface. The horizontal fissure, on the other hand, is found at the junction of superior and the inferior surface. Or we can say that the superior and the inferior surface of cerebellum is demarcated by the horizontal fissure. Using the primary and the posterolateral fissure, we divide the cerebellum into three lobes, namely the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe and the flocculonodular lobe. The anterior lobe is found anterior to the primary fissure, whereas the flocculonodular lobe is found below or posterior to the posterolateral fissure. The posterior lobe is found in between the primary as well as the posterolateral fissure. Subdivisions of cerebellum. Phylogenetically, the cerebellum is divided into three. They are the archicerebellum or the ancient cerebellum, the paleocerebellum or the old cerebellum, and the neocerebellum or the new cerebellum. So each part of the cerebellum is associated with a particular deep cerebellar nuclei, and it have chief communication with certain structures. For example, the archicerebellum is associated with the fastigial nuclei, and has chief communication with the vestibular apparatus. The paleocerebellum is associated with the globose as well as the emboliform nuclei, and it have chief communications with the spinal cord. The newer part of the cerebellum, the neocerebellum, is associated with the dentate nucleus and have chief communication with the pons as well as the thalamus. Coming to the internal structure of cerebellum. The internal structure of cerebellum can be broadly divided into grey matter as well as white matter. The grey matter consists of the cell bodies, whereas the white matter consists of the dendrite and the axons of the neurons. The grey matter. The grey matter is again divided into the outer cortex of the cerebellum and deep cerebellar nuclei, which are embedded in the white matter. Coming to the cortex. The cortex consists of three layers: outer, middle and inner layers of the cortex. The outer layer is also known as the molecular layer. The middle layer is also known as the Purkinje cell layer, whereas the inner layer is also known as the granular layer. The molecular layer consists of stellate as well as basket cells. And the middle Purkinje cell layer, it is a single cell thick layer consisting of only Purkinje cells, which are flask-shaped cells. The inner granular layer consists of granule cell as well as the Golgi cell. So in the diagram we can see that the lowermost part is the white matter. Then we have the inner layer known as the granular layer, the middle single cell thick layer known as the Purkinje cell layer, and the molecular layer. In the molecular layer we have the stellate cells as well as the basket cells. In the Purkinje cell layer, only Purkinje cells are seen. While in the granular layer, we have the granule cell as well as the Golgi cell. The deep cerebellar nuclei. The deep cerebellar nuclei are embedded in the white matter of the cerebellum, and they are 4 in number. From lateral to medial, they are the dentate nucleus, the emboliform nucleus, the globose nucleus, and the most medial is the fastigial nucleus. The dentate nucleus is the most lateral and the largest. It has a crumbled bag appearance, with the opening of the crumbled bag opening medially. The emboliform and the globose nuclei are associated with the paleocerebellum and are together known as the nucleus interpositus. The white matter of cerebellum can be discussed as afferent and efferent fibers. The afferent fibers. The afferent fibers are of two types. They are the climbing fibers as well as the mossy fibers. The climbing fibers originate from the inferior olivary complex, and all other afferent fibers which do not originate from the inferior olivary complex are known as the mossy fibers. So the climbing fibers which originate from the inferior olivary complex consist of two tracts. They are the olivocerebellar tract and the parolivocerebellar tract. So in this diagram, the lowermost part is the white matter, and you can see the climbing fibers as well as the mossy fibers. The climbing fibers, they will reach up to the Purkinje cell layer and will synapse with its dendrites. Whereas the mossy fibers, they will reach only up to the granular layer, where they synapse with the dendrites of the granule cells as well as the axons of the Golgi cell. This site of synapse forms a specialized structure known as the glomerulus. Coming to the efferent fibers of cerebellum. The efferent fibers of the cerebellum arise from the Purkinje cells. So they are the axons of the Purkinje cells, and all of them terminate in the deep cerebellar nuclei. There is one exception, because the efferents coming from the flocculonodular lobe, they do not terminate on the deep cerebellar nuclei. Rather, they will bypass the deep cerebellar nuclei and will terminate in the vestibular nucleus. Connections of cerebellum. So, connections of cerebellum deals with the afferent and efferent fibers that are passing through the 3 cerebellar peduncle. The cerebellar peduncles are structures that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. So, there are 3 cerebellar peduncle: the superior, middle, and the inferior. The superior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum with the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum with the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle will connect the cerebellum with the medulla. So the easiest to study is the middle cerebellar peduncle because it contains one major afferent fibers, which is the pontocerebellar fibers, and it do not contain any efferent fibers. So the middle cerebellar peduncle contains the pontocerebellar fibers. The pontocerebellar fibers are actually part of the cortico-pontocerebellar tract. It is through this tract that the cerebellum is connected to the cerebral cortex. After middle cerebellar peduncle, we have the superior cerebellar peduncle. So as a rule of thumb, all afferent and efferent fibers passing through the superior cerebellar peduncle is either originating or terminating in nuclei at the level of the midbrain or at an above level. For example, the tectocerebellar tract, it is arising from the tectum or the superior and the inferior colliculus, which is located in the midbrain. The trigeminocerebellar tract, it is arising from the mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve, which is located in the midbrain. The hypothalamocerebellar tract, it arises from the hypothalamus. The reticulocerebellar tract will arise from the reticular nuclei located in the midbrain. An exception to the general rule is the ventral spinocerebellar tract because it is not arising from the midbrain or at a higher level, it is rather arising from the spinal cord. All efferent fibers through the superior cerebellar peduncle will terminate at a nuclei at the level of the midbrain or at a level above it. For example, the cerebello-rubral tract will terminate at the red nucleus of midbrain. The cerebello-reticular tract will terminate at the reticular nucleus in the midbrain. The cerebello-hypothalamic tract will end at the hypothalamus. Again, an exception to the general rule is the cerebello-olivary tract because it is terminating at the inferior olivary complex, which is located in the medulla. Lastly, we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The inferior cerebellar peduncle, as a general rule, all the afferent fibers will arise from the nuclei located at the level of medulla or at the spinal cord. Also, the efferent fibers will terminate at the level of medulla. So the examples are the cuneo-cerebellar tract, which arise from the nucleus cuneatus, the olivocerebellar and the parolivocerebellar, which originate from the inferior olivary complex. The vestibulocerebellar tract is arising from the vestibular nucleus. The trigeminocerebellar tract, it is arising from the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve located at the level of medulla. The dorsal spinocerebellar tract is arising from the level of spinal cord. Coming to the efferent fibers, the cerebello-olivary tract will end in the inferior olivary nucleus. The cerebello-vestibular tract will end in the vestibular nuclei, and the cerebello-reticular tract is ending at the reticular nuclei present in the level of medulla. Coming to the arterial supply of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is supplied by two branches of the basilar artery and one branch of the vertebral artery. The basilar artery is formed at the level of lower border of pons by the union of the two vertebral artery of each side. So the two branches of the basilar artery are the superior cerebellar artery and the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, whereas the branch of the vertebral artery is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now the area supplied by this artery is indicated by the name. For example, the superior cerebellar artery supplies the superior surface of cerebellum. The anterior inferior cerebellar artery is supplying the anterior part of the inferior surface. Likely, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery is supplying the posterior part of inferior surface. The diagram shows the cross section of cerebellum. At the lower border of the pons, the two vertebral artery will join together to form the basilar artery. The two branches of the basilar artery supplying the cerebellum are the superior cerebellar artery, which supplies the superior surface, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery supplying the anterior part of inferior surface, and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is the branch of the vertebral artery, it supplies the posterior part of inferior surface.